can see within one, or can observe one's own activity of the brain, that it is really like a computer that's been programmed and remembers. And it is conditioned.
Yes.
Conditioned by past generations, by the society, by the newspapers, by the magazines, by all the activities and pressure from the outside.
But the conditioning which determines the self, which determines
the psyche.
The psyche, or you call it the psyche.
Let's call it for the moment the psyche. The self.
The self, the psyche. That conditioning is what you're talking about. That may not only be unnecessary but harmful. Right?
Yes, that's what we were discussing too.
Yes.
That the emphasis on the psyche, as we are doing now, and giving importance to the self, is creating great damage in the world.
But the conditioning of the brain, as I see it, is involving with an illusion which we call the self.
That's right. Can that conditioning be dissipated?
Yes.
That's the whole question.
Yes, and it really has to be dissipated in some physical and chemical and neurophysiological sense, right?
Yes.
But thought, the brain, it seems to me, is running on its own, from its own program, right?
Yes, it's like a computer that's running on its own program.
Yes. Now, essentially, what you're asking is that the brain that should really be responding to the mind.
That it can only respond if it is free from the thought which is limited.
Now then, and we say mind, not only, in reality, even brain is not divided, because we're saying that we're all not only basically similar, but really connected, right? And then we say beyond all that is mind, which has no division at all.
It is unconditioned.
Yes, it would almost seem to imply then that insofar as a person feels he is a separate being, he has very little contact with mind, right?
Absolutely, quite right. That's what we say.
Has no mind.
That's why it's very important to understand, not the mind, but my conditioning. Mm-hmm. Then whether that my conditioning, the human conditioning, can ever be dissolved. That's the real issue.
We don't really understand the nature of our thought process. We're not aware of how it works, and it's really disrupting not only our society and our individual lives, but also the way that the brain and nervous system operate, making us unhealthy or perhaps even subtly damaging the system. And now, Krishnamurti recognizes that thought, rational, orderly, factual thought, such as in proper doing science, is necessary and valuable, but the kind of thought that he has in mind is self-centered thought. That is, now, at first sight, one might wonder why self-centered thought is so bad. If the self were really there, then perhaps it would be correct to center it on the self, because the self would be so important. But if the self is a kind of illusion, at least the self as we know it, then to center our thought on something illusory, which is assumed to have supreme importance, is going to disrupt the whole process, and it will not only make thought about yourself wrong, it will make thought about everything wrong, so that thought becomes a dangerous and destructive instrument. If you just think of the word self, its basic meaning is the quintessence, the essence of all essences, and that would of course have supreme value. Now, if we assume there is a self, and we feel that this stirs up the whole mind and brain inside, so it feels just from that assumption that something is going on inside, which corresponds to this assumed self and gives it an apparent reality. Now, once it has been assumed that this self is real and not merely an image, it's attributed reality, then everything becomes, it takes first priority and everything else comes second, so everything is distorted. Yes, because this image of the self, the concept of the self is assumed to be so all-important, the brain starts to develop a defense mechanism to defend this image against what we call, quote, apparently to defend the image against perception of its falseness or illusory character. You can see this very easily, that if somebody says you are an idiot, there's an immediate response to say, I'm not an idiot. That it's painful to have an image of yourself as an idiot. Therefore, you say you're wrong, and you may start adopting all sorts of false explanations to show that you are okay and the other person is the idiot. But this is only a minor point compared with the tremendous energy that comes in when the very existence of this image is apparently threatened by some evidence that it's only an image, it's only an illusion. Then the entire brain starts to be disrupted, the brain and nervous system, and as a result a defense mechanism comes in just to block it or to wipe it out or to turn attention somewhere else. Now this defense mechanism, part of the defense is to make us unconscious of it. You see, the major form of defense is simply concealment of what's going on, because if we could see what's going on, it would be obvious it's an illusion. It's like seeing through the trick of the magician. So also, all the ways I've described, such as forgetting and zapping your mind or jumping to something else, are modes of concealment. You may also conceal by just denying that it's so and asserting something else. And therefore, we are not conscious we are not conscious certainly of the defense mechanism, because this process of concealment itself has to be concealed in order to make it effective. And therefore, the defense, the major part of the defense, consists in making the whole process unconscious.
Our brain is limited, conditioned through vast experience, knowledge, conditioned. But to discover the quality of the brain, which is not conditioned, and therefore infinite capacity, but it is conditioned now, as British, as French, as all the rest. I believe, I don't believe, I believe in God, he is my guru, that guru is better than this guru. You follow? All that nonsense is going on. So, as it is conditioned, its capacity is limited, and only when that conditioning is totally free, that means no faith, no fear, no, you follow? No attachment of any kind to anything. So, is it possible for the brain to be unconditioned? Which means, is it possible for the brain to be free of the known? That is, I have to know where I have to go home, which road to take, what language I speak. I have to, there is knowledge. But to be free psychologically, which is the conditioning, which has been conditioned, which the brain has been conditioned, to be free, conditioned by knowledge, to be free of that, then it has got extraordinary capacity. Then we are saying, what is the mind? Instead we talk of consciousness, the brain and the mind. When the brain is completely free of that psychological knowledge, then the brain is the mind, because mind is infinite.
Krishnamurti is suggesting, proposing, or even saying that the self is not the source of thought, but rather thought is the source of the self. Now, that may seem paradoxical to our ordinary experience, but at least we can make it reasonable. You see, if we're saying that the assumption of the self creates inside a kind of image of the self corresponding to that assumption with great power, and that image is attributed reality, and you get a feeling that it's real. Therefore, you form the assumption that there is the self who is the thinker, the source of thought, and there is that which he is thinking about, And besides that, there's the thought, which is produced by the thinker, which refers to what he is thinking about. Now, therefore, the things which really are solidly existent in that view are the thinker and what he is thinking about. Thought is a very ethereal, almost non-existent thing. But what is being suggested instead is that the thought process is real. It's going on in the brain and nervous system, and this thought process contains in it the assumption of a thinker who produces thought. So it's as it were producing a television program of a thinker producing thought, and the mind is watching that program so intently that it takes that to be the reality. And then, therefore, thought now says, I am very modest, I am serving the thinker, but in fact it's serving itself, because it is always, it produces this thinker and then does what this thinker wants.
Dave was very careful to see if he couldn't get him to be more specific in the way he used language. Because sometimes he was very poetic about his use of language, which would be good in some respects. But if he wanted to convey a specific idea, it was important to get it clear that people would understand. A poetic idea, a poetic expression can mean one thing to one person. It can mean something quite different to another person. And that would be all right if he wanted to convey the feeling. But if he was wanting also to convey a specific idea, which he did want to, he felt very strongly about that, it was important to get it clear. And so Dave would stop him very often, which I think didn't please some people, but I think Krishnaji appreciated that he did get him to be more careful about the way he used words.